This is the last of 3 lectures from Chapter 10 about chemical bonding, and this particular lecture is going to cover the theories we have about what happens on an atomic/molecular level when orbitals overlap to form chemical bonds. So the 2 theories we're going to talk about are the valence bond theory and molecular orbital theory. So just a brief definition of both of them to begin with. In both cases, the theory suggests that when 2 atoms are beginning to bond, they will approach each other, and the atomic orbitals on each of the atoms that are making a bond will begin to overlap. In the case of the valence bond theory, the theory says that when the atomic orbitals overlap, they form hybridized orbitals. And so just like a hybrid in just regular dictionary is a blend of 2 or more things, same thing with hybridized orbitals. Valence bond theory says that as the atomic orbitals overlap, they form new molecular orbitals that are hybrids containing some properties from each of the individual atomic orbitals that overlap. Valence bond theory has some faults, some areas that it doesn't work very well with, but it does work very well for predicting molecular shape. So that's primarily why it's still used today. It's not as sophisticated as the molecular orbital theory, and it doesn't explain some properties of molecules, which are explained by molecular orbital. Okay, and again, a brief definition for the molecular orbital theory. Again, as 2 atoms approach to make a chemical bond, the atomic orbitals are theorized to overlap, but in this case, instead of forming hybrids, we just say they simply form molecular orbitals, and there will always be a molecular orbital form that's lower in energy, and there will always be a molecular orbital form that's higher in energy. The lower energy one in molecular orbital theory is called a bonding molecular orbital. The higher energy one is called an anti-bonding molecular orbital. Molecular orbital theory is actually very sophisticated and explains very detailed properties of molecules. So just kind of a little tidbit to commit to memory. Regardless of the theory you're talking about, there is such a thing as conservation of orbitals. In other words, however many atomic orbitals you begin with, you must end up with the same number of molecular orbitals. All right, so let's spend some time explaining valence bond theory. Remember, that's the one that says that when 2 atoms are approaching each other to bond, the atomic orbitals blend together to form hybrid molecular orbitals. So I like to use carbon to begin with. If you were to draw out the electron configuration of carbon, be 1s2, 2s2, 2p2. Carbon has 4 valence electrons, okay? 2 plus 2 is 4. And if you were to draw the orbital configuration for carbon, it would look like this. So if you were to just look at the orbital configuration for carbon without any knowledge of carbon, you might think that carbon makes 2 bonds. You have 2 unpaired electrons. We know that electrons typically like to be paired. But that would not be the case. We know that carbon forms 4 bonds and makes tetrahedral shapes. And so the person who came up with valence bond theory, which by the way happens to be Linus Pauling, thought of the valence bond theory to explain this. So the best way to explain hybrid orbitals is to show this particular diagram, and this is something you should understand well, be able to recreate and be able to explain. So if we look at the orbital diagram for carbon, and we're only in this case looking at the valence electrons, it's only valence electrons that are involved in bonding. And so Linus Pauling suggested that one of the s valence electrons get promoted to the empty p orbital. So now it looks pretty obvious that carbon would want to make 4 bonds. The problem with stopping at this part of the theory is that you would expect, if this were the case, that carbon would make 3 identical bonds by pairing the p electrons, and one bond, a 4th bond, that's just a little different because the electron is in an s orbital, or s sublevel, not a p sublevel. However, we know that when carbon makes 4 bonds with 4 identical atoms, all the bonds are equivalent. There's no difference. So that's when Linus Pauling came up with the idea of hybridized orbitals. He said, okay, we're going to combine these orbitals, atomic orbitals, and make 4 identical orbitals, hybrid orbitals. I want you to, just for a moment, notice how these orbitals are named. sp3 hybrid. A couple things I want you to notice. The name of the hybrid orbital itself tells you what atomic orbitals made it up. In this case, there's 1 s and 3 p's. Okay. Also, if you pay attention to the name of the hybrid, you can count how many of these identical hybrid orbits there are. So if you have 1 s and you have 3 p's, okay, you have a total of 4 orbitals. And because of conservation of orbitals, if we start with 4 orbitals, atomic orbitals, we must end up with 4 hybrid orbitals. So anytime you see sp3 hybrid orbitals, there are 4 of them. Just kind of peeking ahead, there are 5 different types of hybrid orbitals that can be formed, listed right here. And again, the name of each type of hybrid tells you where they came from. So sp comes from 1s and 1p. sp3d2 comes from 1s, 3 p's, and 2d atomic orbitals. So not only do you know from the name what orbitals they came from, you also know how many of that type of hybrid there are. So in the case of sp, since it started with 2 atomic orbitals, it must form 2 identical hybrid orbitals. So anytime you see sp, there are going to be 2 of them that are identical. Similarly, if you see sp3d2 hybrids, let's see, 1 plus 3 is 4 plus 2 more is 6. That means there will be 6 identical sp3d2 orbitals anytime you get that hybridization. So here's kind of a breakdown of how you get each of the 5 different types of hybrids that are possible. If you combine 1s and 1p, you get sp hybrid orbitals, 2 of them. If you combine 1s and 2p's, you get sp2, 3 sp2 hybrids, on and on. So I would, if you haven't already jotted this slide down, this is probably a good one to jot down and make sure you understand. All right, so a little bit more detail about each of the type of hybrids. sp3 means, remember there are 4 of them because there's 1s and there's 3p, so that's a total of 4 atomic orbitals you started with. So you're going to end up with 4 hybrid orbitals. And so what type of molecule needs sp3 hybridization? A molecule that has 4 electron domains. Okay, so for example, CH4 methane, The central carbon has 4 electron domains around it, so it needs sp3 hybridization. Okay, it needs 4 areas to hold the bonding electrons. Okay, so one thing to write down and commit to memory is when you're determining hybridization, you're looking at the number of electron domains around the central atom. So let's look for a minute at ammonia, NH3. If you were to draw the Lewis dot structure, and before you do anything in this unit, before you determine shape, polarity, hybridization, you must draw a Lewis dot structure. So if you draw the Lewis dot structure for ammonia, you find there's a lone pair on the nitrogen, and that there are, in fact, 4 electron domains. So ammonia also needs sp3 hybridization. And so it's good to keep in mind that hybrid orbitals are used for bonding electrons and to hold lone pairs of electrons. So in the case of ammonia, one of the sp3 orbitals holds the lone pair and the other 3 hold the bonding electrons. I will not ask you to draw images of hybrid orbitals, but sometimes a picture kind of helps you grasp something. So this is showing formation of sp3 hybrids. So if you combine an s atomic orbital, which are spherical, and you combine 2p orbitals, which we know are dumbbell shape, hopefully, you're going to come up with sp2 hybrids, 3 of them, right? Conservation of orbitals. And they're all going to be identical to one another, just oriented different in space. So what type of molecule will need and use sp2 hybridization? One that has 3 electron domains. So I'm hoping you remember that boron is happy with only 6 valence electrons. So let's look at BF3. Okay. BF3 only has, because there's no lone pair, BF3 has 3 electron domains, so it does need sp2 hybridization. And we know that when we have 3 domains, the geometry is trigonal planar and bond angles are 120. So I'm hoping now you should be seeing a connection between hybridization and the shape of the molecule. So again, another visual to show formation of sp hybrids. Of course, that's 1s and 1p atomic orbital combined to give you 2 sp hybrid molecular orbitals. And a molecule that would need sp hybridization is one that has 2 electron domains. So here's an example down here. You have 2 domains. Remember that double and triple bonds count only as 1 domain. And so any molecule that has sp hybridization is going to be linear with a 180-degree bond angle. One of the things I'm going to start talking about now are the types of bonds. It turns out that there are multiple types of bonds. There is a single bond is always called a sigma bond. So a single bond is called a sigma bond, and it's not real important you actually know what this bond is, but sigma bond is the strongest type of bond. It's a head-to-head overlap, direct overlap of atomic orbitals. What I want to point out here more, and I'll mention it later in this talk too, is that when you have multiple bonds, when you have a double or triple bond, the bonds that make it up are different types. So for example, in a triple bond, such as this, one of the bonds is a sigma and the other 2 are pi bonds. So a pi bond is weaker than a sigma. It's not a result of direct head-to-head overlap of orbitals. It's kind of, if you side-to-side overlap. So if you kind of sidle up to somebody shoulder to shoulder, that would be like a pi bond. If you smashed heads with somebody, that would be like a sigma bond. So here's a visual of the different type of bonds. So direct head-to-head overlap is the sigma bond that's stronger. And remember, that's what all single bonds are. They're all sigma bonds. And then this side-to-side overlap, even though in this picture it looks like they're not overlapping, they are. That is your pi bond, which is not quite as strong. And pi bonds only pop up when you have double or triple bonds. Okay, they're only like second and third bonds. All right, so a summary for these type of bonds. If you have a single bond, you only have a sigma bond. All single bonds are sigma bonds. If you have a double bond, one of the double bonds will be sigma and the other bond in the double bond will be a pi bond. If you have a triple bond, as I showed on the other slide, one of the bonds will be sigma and the other two will be pi bonds. So that just needs to be committed to memory. All right, just to touch on the final two hybridizations. We've talked about SP, SP2, and SP3. What if you have an atom that has 5 domains around, or a molecule that has 5 domains around a central atom? This is arsenic pentafluoride. If you have 5 domains, you need 5 equal hybrid orbitals. And so what those are is sp3d hybridization. And remember, if you have 5 domains, it's trigonal bipyramidal geometry. Trigonal bipyramidal is the complicated one. They have 2 different angles. The angle between an axial and equatorial is 90 degrees, and the angle between 2 equatorial is 120 degrees. And finally, if you have 6 domains around a central atom, the hybridization is sp3d2, which is an octahedral geometry. And here is a summary. So there's not really anything new in this chart. You should already know the electron domains and what electron domain shape is associated with them. What's new is you now have to associate however many electron domains you have with a hybridization. So you may want to print this down or jot it down. All right, so if I ask you a problem, which I will on the test, and I give you some molecule and I say, okay, predict the hybridization, show all your work, how would you do that? It's quite a task and one that you need to practice several times. You always want to start by drawing the Lewis structure, always. You cannot predict a shape, electron domains, polarity, or hybridization unless you start with a correct Lewis structure. Once you have the correct Lewis structure, you're going to figure out how many electron domains are around the central atom, and at that point you can tell me about the shape, the polarity, and the hybridization. So here's a practice one. What if I asked you, tell me about the hybridization of bromine trifluoride? It's probably worth reviewing how to draw a Lewis structure. And so the first thing you want to do is count valence electrons. So bromine has 7. Each fluorine also has 7. And so bromine trifluoride has 28 valence electrons. I'm going to start, the first atom is almost always the central. I'm going to start by drawing single bonds between the central atom and the others. Then I'm going to give all of the outside atoms an octet. And at that point, I'm going to count how many electrons I have used. At this point, I have used 24 electrons. I need to use 28, so I have 4 more electrons left. Any extra electrons go on the central atom. Notice now that bromine has 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 electrons around it. It has expanded its octet, which is fine. Bromine is in the third period of the periodic table. It's capable of doing, well, it's actually, wait, it's actually in the fourth. But yes, so it can definitely expand its octet. So how many domains do we have around the central atom? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. And that means what? That means we're talking about trigonal bipyramidal electron domain shape. If we have 5 domains, that means our hybridization, we need 5 hybrid orbitals. So 1 plus, that's 1 plus 3, and plus 1 more. Whoops, D. So our hybridization is sp3d. Now I realize I didn't ask you to tell me the molecular geometry, but let's just do that now anyway, because that's something you're going to need to be able to do in the test. So if you start with the electron domain geometry for, let me change colors here, for bromine trifluoride. You know what, I am going to get an extra page. All right, much better. So if I have bromine trifluoride, now if you have trigonal bipyramidal electron domain shape and you have lone pairs always go into the equatorial position. They have more room to kind of spread out. And so here's basically the molecular geometry. Okay, what does that look like? Yep, that is T-shaped. So if you're fuzzy or never got confident about molecular shapes, make sure you are now. So that is T-shaped for the molecular shape. Bond angles, 90. And here's kind of a more formal answer to that question if you need to look it over. All right, we're going to transition into molecular orbital theory. Why did scientists develop molecular orbital theory? Because there are some properties of molecules that the valence bond theory falls on its face. One of the more important ones has to do with properties we call either paramagnetic or diamagnetic for molecules. Paramagnetic molecule means that it has some unpaired electrons. Okay? Diamagnetic means that in that molecule all of the electrons are paired. There are no unpaired electrons. So I kind of remember these because I think they sound the opposite of what they should be. Para means they are unpaired. Okay. Anyway, why is that important? If you have electrons have a charge, right, and they're spinning, so they're going to create a magnetic field. If you have any unpaired electrons, that molecule is going to be magnetic, and it really is. It's cool. I used to do a lab with that. And if all of the electrons, on the other hand, are paired, all of these magnetic fields are going to be opposing each other, and there's going to be no magnetism with that molecule. Just kind of a quick mention. Valence bond theories makes hybrid orbitals that are just kind of separate from one another. Molecular orbital theory, the molecular orbitals are huge, and they're kind of spread over the entire molecule. So we say that the electrons in a molecular orbital are delocalized or spread out. And that explains some properties better too. All right, so molecular orbital theory is much more sophisticated than valence bond theory. What it does is it takes Schrodinger's wave equation, mathematical formula, and combines them. So if you take physics, for example, and you combine waves, you know that they combine in two ways. They can either combine constructively, where you add the waves together, or they can combine destructively and essentially cancel each other out. So same is the case when making molecular orbitals. We combine the wave functions for the two atomic orbitals, And when they combine, when the two waves combine constructively, we end up with what we call bonding molecular orbitals that are more stable, lower in energy. And then if they combine destructively, we end up with anti-bonding molecular orbitals that are higher in energy and undesirable. So just to give you a real simple-minded idea, if we combine two s orbitals to make a bond, we're going to end up with two molecular orbitals. One of them is going to be a bonding molecular orbital that's lower in energy, and one is going to end up with an anti-bonding that's higher in energy. And just a little note here, this little asterisk designates anti-bonding orbitals. So most of the questions I'm going to ask you on your test about molecular orbital theory will be extra credit. I will ask you something very basic about them, but the meat of the work on molecular orbital theory will be extra credit. All right. Here's a really simple example of how you work with molecular orbital theory. If you consider energy along the y-axis, let's say that we have two lithium atoms that are approaching each other, and we want to know if they're going to make a bond, okay, to make Li2. So if we drew a molecular orbital theory, remember the theory says that when they combine, when the atomic orbitals combine, they make a bonding molecular orbital, which is lower in energy, and they make an anti-bonding orbital, which is higher in energy. So what we do is on the far left and far right, those are the atomic orbitals, and only deal with valence electrons. That's all that's involved in bonding. And so each lithium atom, before it bonds, has one valence electron, so we're going to put one electron in each of the 2s valence orbitals. And then what you do is you count total number of valence electrons you have from both atoms that are bonding. We have 1 plus 1 is 2. And you start filling up the molecular orbitals, going from the lowest energy to highest energy. Well, since we only have 2 valence electrons to place, they both go into the bonding molecular orbital, and the anti-bonding orbital is empty, which is good. So that means that this bond will in fact form. I will not make you memorize, so don't go trying to memorize these structures. I know they look quite complex, but I just want you to look as we get more complicated, as you get to larger atoms, or atoms with more valence electrons, I should say, that are trying to bond with each other. This is what the molecular orbital setup looks like. So of course you have atoms that have valence electrons in s and p orbitals, okay, so you need to include s and p. And then your molecular orbitals that are formed get a bit more complicated also. So I would not make you construct these diagrams, but in an extra credit problem, probably what I will do is give you the appropriate diagram and ask you to fill in electrons where they're appropriate and show whether or not a particular bond will form. So, for example, you can stop listening now if you have no interest in the bonus question. I'm going to walk you through molecular orbital theory construction for a few different molecules at this point. So oxygen, if you were to draw a Lewis dot structure of oxygen, it would look like this. There's a double bond between the two oxygens. And actually, that was one of the reasons that valence bond theory started to fall out of favor and molecular orbital theory was developed, because it turns out that when you have molecular oxygen, it is paramagnetic. Do you remember what that means? That means there are unpaired electrons in orbitals. And how do we know that? Because oxygen is magnetic. It actually exerts a magnetic field. And so if you just looked at valence bond theory, I hope this doesn't confuse you more than it helps. If you just looked at valence bond theory and you have the orbital diagram for two oxygen atoms, okay, and you combine them, it looks very simple, right? Like you would just combine the atomic orbitals, and when you did so, they would all pair up and you'd be happy, right? So it looks like if you just look at simple combination of atomic orbitals, like all of the electrons in O2 should be paired. That's not the case though. The properties of oxygen tell us that we have unpaired electrons someplace. So valence bond theory does not work with oxygen. So let's use a molecular orbital diagram with oxygen and see what we come up with. Well, if you were to draw the electron configuration for oxygen atom, it'd be 1s2, 2s2, 2p4. Remember, we're only interested in the valence electrons for bonding. And so if remember the far left and the far right represent the atoms that are trying to bond, in this case 2 oxygen atoms. And so you draw the orbital diagram for the oxygen atoms, and here we have 2s2, 2p4. Remember to follow Hund's rule. And in the middle, and again I would provide you this diagram, you have the molecular orbitals. So what you do is you count total valence electrons that you start with. So on each side we have, let's see, 2, 4, 5, 6. We have, well, oxygen has 6 valence electrons, right? So each oxygen atom has 6 valence electrons to contribute. Conservation of electrons, that means that we have a total of 12 valence electrons that we need to place in the molecular orbitals. Start at the lowest energy. So here's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Now follow Hund's rule. That means 1 electron in each equal energy orbital before you pair them. So by using the molecular orbital theory, hopefully you can see that now you have unpaired electrons. So that explains the paramagnetism of oxygen. Actually, molecular orbital theory does a very good job. Okay, and you should understand what bond order is, a very simple concept, but I have seen it asked on the ACS. Bond order is simply how many bonds are between 2 atoms. So if you have fluorine and somebody says, what's the bond order? It's 1. There's 1 bond between that. If you're looking at oxygen and somebody says, what's the bond order for the oxygen-oxygen? The bond order would be 2 because there are 2 bonds between those atoms, okay? So it's very simple. You can also determine bond order from a molecular orbital diagram, and that will allow you to predict if a bond will in fact form. If you get a bond order of 0, no bond is forming, okay? So using a molecular orbital theory, again, this would be an extra credit thing. The formula that you would use is you want a net excess of bonding electrons in order for 2 atoms to bond. So, but you're going to take the total bonding electrons, that is electrons in a bonding orbital, and you're going to subtract from that the total electrons in anti-bonding orbitals. And then you're going to divide it by 2, and that will give you the bond order from a molecular diagram. So, let's look at doing a molecular orbital diagram for fluorine. Okay. Fluorine's electron configuration is 1s2, 2s2, 2p5. And so on the far left and far right, you show the orbital configurations for fluorine atoms. We have a total of, each fluorine has 7 valence electrons. So we have a total of 14 electrons that need to be placed in the molecular orbital, starting with the lowest energy. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. How can you tell from this molecular orbital diagram what the bond order of fluorine is? Now, you already know the bond. If you draw a Lewis structure, you know the bond order of fluorine is 1. There's only one single bond. But let's see how we would determine that. Basically, the bond order are the number of leftover electron pairs in bonding orbitals. So you can use that formula on the previous page. I'm going to show you an easier way. If there are equal electrons in bonding orbital as there is in the anti-bonding orbital, they cancel each other out. Okay, so there's no net bonding going on down here. In the top part, you have 1, 2, 3 electron pairs in bonding orbitals, in orbitals that are lower in energy. And you have 2 pairs in an anti-bonding orbital. Okay, so what is the net difference between bonding and anti-bonding? Well, 2, 4, 6. We have 6 in the bonding. We have 4 electrons in anti-bonding. So we have 2 electrons divided by 2. In other words, 1 electron pair, or bond order of 1. So if that confuses you, go through use the formula and make sure you can do that again for bonus credit. All right, so here's one for you to try. If you're going to have any hope of doing the extra credit, you need to be able to do this. So pretend like you don't know what the structure of N2 is, and go through the process, see if you can figure out, if you can fill in this chart for nitrogen, and you can figure out its bond order from there. Just to get you started, you need to start with drawing out the electron configuration for nitrogen atoms. So, and remember, there's going to be 1 nitrogen atom, 1 in the far left, 1 in the far right. Put its valence electrons in these orbitals, and then after that, fill up the molecular orbitals. Here is a completed molecular orbital diagram for nitrogen. Again, since we have equal number of electrons in bonding and anti-bonding for the S level, these don't even count. We have a total of 6 valence electrons in the bonding orbitals on the top part, and none in the anti-bonding orbitals. So our formula tells us to divide by 2 and tells us that nitrogen has a bond order of 3, which fits with reality. If you draw out a Lewis structure of nitrogen, you're going to find out there's a triple bond in between it. So it does, in fact, have a bond order 3. So molecular orbital theory works very well. Finally done with this very long video on bonding theories.